Right, good morning everybody, and welcome to this morning's Bco event. We've just been sorting out one or two things with Orestis on the Biomed team, so let's give one or two of you a couple of minutes to hopefully grab a coffee. I think, bearing in mind we're past 11, I will start straight away. My name's Mike Ayton, by the way, and I'm the chair of the East Anglia region. Delighted to have you all signed up this morning, both locally and from further afield, so welcome to all. Just by way of background, we ran a very successful virtual tour of the Works building at the Unity campus in Cambridge, just to the south of Cambridge in Sawston. That was back in July, and that was one of the first Bco events where we actually ran a virtual tour of the building. That was organised by the Howard Group and was very successful, as I say. This morning, I'm delighted that we're going to bring you a brand new R&D lab and office development at Babraham Research Campus, which sits in the heart of the Cambridge R&D science cluster on the south side of Cambridge, and it's been developed by Biomed Realty. Having seen firsthand the work involved with the Sawston virtual tour and all the effort that took, I'm grateful to Orestis from Biomed Realty, and also to Duncan from their architects, NORR, for agreeing to present the tour this morning. Really, my only regret is that we're unable to do a live tour. We have a really interesting selection of buildings in Cambridge and surrounding area that would be great to showcase to our members, and obviously we did that last year. As a committee, we're working hard to see whether we can do live tours, not this year, as you can understand, but certainly during Q1. In particular, we've got our eyes on a live physical tour of the new ARM HQ on the southeast side of Cambridge. It'd be really good if we can get that sorted, so watch this space. This event is only one of a wide range of webinars and online events that the Bco organises, and whilst I appreciate there may be an element of Zoom fatigue creeping in amongst you, nevertheless they are informative, they are educational, and they're great for clocking up for CPD. So do look out for those events as and when they're posted online. The absence of live tours, and indeed the cancellation of our annual lunch, which actually would have taken place last week, for those who keep an eye on the on your diaries. So we've missed the annual lunch, unfortunately, but it means that unfortunately we're not able to meet up face to face as we would have done, and as much as we would have liked. I hope that will change next year. As I said, if we can start organising some live events. One final point, one little plug I'd like to make just before I hand over to Orestis. At last year's lunch, I did make a statement that I would try and engage the younger members of our profession, the next gen, into the Bco. I'm still on that mission. It's a bit more tricky in the current circumstances, but next gen membership is cheap, and it's relative, or it's cheap relative to your corporate membership. So if there are any companies out there listening in this morning, if you do have graduates and young professionals in your teams, please do think about enrolling them into the Bco. That way they can then learn, they can profit from the varied events that we lay on, and they can also access the considerable amount of research that the Bco is committed to producing each year. Also, we will be rolling out a new mentoring program. That's going to be relaunched. It's already running in a couple of regions in London and up in the Midlands, but it's going to be relaunched nationally, and we're aiming to do that in December. And I think again that will be another big benefit to the next gen. It's obviously aimed at the next gen end. So if there are budding mentors, if there are budding mentees, then that will be something to think about for the end of the year and moving into next year. But that's my plug for the next gen this morning. Without further ado, let's proceed with the tour, the presentation of Babraham Research Campus. I will hand over to Orestis and then on to Duncan, and then happily pick up on any Q&A and give you a quick rundown of maybe some future events once we've finished with the tour. So, Orestis, if you're happy, let's run.
Thank you, Mike, and yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for this virtual tour of Biomed at Babraham, the latest addition to the Babraham Research Campus. Before we get going with the building, the virtual building tour as it is, I'd like to spend a couple of moments just to give you a bit of an introduction to us as a business for those that are not familiar. Obviously, Biomed Realty is a global development and investment company specializing in the life sciences sector. You will see here on the map our global presence across a number of markets. In the States, we've got about just over 11 million square feet in total on the various markets that we operate. You see here on the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego. West Coast, Cambridge in Massachusetts, our largest market in terms of footprint. New York and obviously Cambridge, UK, we've got just over 1 million square feet in total. The business is very much centered around relationships. We've got a number of tenants in a portfolio, just over 225 organizations so far. You'll see some of them on the screen here. And it's offering effectively real estate solutions to the life science community across the board. That is from sort of early stage companies all the way to growth space and the more established sort of businesses in the field. And with that in mind, in Cambridge, UK, Biomed at Babraham, the product that we're showcasing here today, is very much about the growth space for businesses that have outgrown the incubation space, the early sort of startup level. They're not there yet in terms of sort of full growth, but they're in a sort of growing mode, and that's what this particular product was set out to cater for. The campus itself, Babraham Research Campus, obviously 6 miles south of Cambridge, 430 acres of sort of pristine landscape surroundings. The campus itself has been going for a number of years and has organically grown. To date, it's home to over 60 organizations that specialize in the biomedical sector. They co-locate here, and that has a number of benefits in terms of the clustering effect, both in terms of proximity to like-minded companies with whom they share a lot of expertise and research, but also the co-location on a campus that has got the Babraham Institute, but also BBT that offer a level of services that is unrivaled in the field, from facilities management, operation, access to state-of-the-art equipment. And those are just a few reasons why people choose Babraham Research Campus as their home. It offers 200,000 square feet, just over 200,000 square feet of total space as a campus over 9 buildings. You see some of the names here that some of you may be familiar with in terms of tenants. And again, it was centered around the main hall, a listed building, and as I said, has organically grown over the decades to be recognized sort of leading science park in the region that it is. Our discussions started a number of years ago with BBSSE, BBT, to try and help with the expansion of the campus to provide that follow-on space that is very critical to growing businesses. And indeed, we delivered earlier this year in the midst of a pandemic. These 2 buildings, they offer 100,000 square feet of fully fitted office and laboratory space. And we're very pleased that they have been quite successful in take-up, despite the prevailing circumstances. The buildings today are fully leased, and we've managed to get them operational, as I said, in Q2 this year, when most of the tenants have moved in. A couple of other things, just very briefly, on the campus itself, and there is a very interesting impact report that was issued earlier this summer. The gross added value of Babraham and its importance not just to the region, but to the UK economy, is the gross value add of the campus, which is in excess of £280 million. It's also worth noting that the top 14 companies that have developed and grown on the campus over the number of years are worth over £4 billion in market capitalization terms. And 47% of all the funds that were raised in the private markets in the last few years in the Cambridge region are for companies based here. So I think its significance as a driver for cutting edge research and development is not to be underestimated, certainly both in the region, but also to the UK PLC. I'll probably hand over to Duncan now, who can talk a bit more about the actual design of the buildings and also look through the various spaces that we configured. And yeah, Duncan, if I can hand over to you to talk a little more about the buildings themselves.
Thank you very much, Orestis. So just initially, some base information on the buildings. So there's two 5,000 square metre buildings on the R&D2 site. The site is actually located on the Greenbelt, on the edge of the Babraham campus. We originally got outline consent back in 2017. So two 5,000 square metre buildings. Each building has 4,500 square metres of lettable accommodation within it. And that's divided into 4 potential tenancy areas, 2 per floor, which each of which is 1,125 square metres each. Obviously, a tenant can take more than 1 wing or more than 1 floor. The net to gross on the buildings is 90%. The occupancy levels are assumed for design purposes 1 per 20 square metres, which is a total of 225 people or 55 people per tenancy. Obviously, being a lab type building, the occupancy levels are lower than they would be in an office development, because what tends to happen is people occupy a write-up space and also a lab space. So the numbers of people in the building would be less than if it was a pure office building. In terms of car parking, there's 333 spaces, a ratio of 1 per 30 square metres. The original fit out for the building undertaken by SDC was a Cat A fit out. And then there was a subsequent Cat B fit out undertaken almost immediately after the Cat A fit out was finished. And that's a Cat B fit out which is customizable to suit individual tenant requirements. In other words, it was basically a generic fit out, but was modified to suit tenants that came on board during the construction period and is modifiable to suit tenants that may come in the future or changes to tenants. The base building layout, now in terms of the key thing with this was flexibility. That's particularly the case with a lab building. Because one of the issues with this type of building is it's difficult to predict how much office space and how much lab space each tenant will require. That can vary from 60% office, 40% lab to the other way around, 6% lab to 40% office. So we need to be building that flexibility. We also wanted to, as I say, do this partial fit out because that was attractive to incoming tenants as they could get into the building relatively quickly and also without a lot of capital outlay. Obviously, one way of providing ultimate flexibility would just be to say you can put the offices anywhere, you can put the labs anywhere, but that in itself doesn't lend itself to a partial fit out. It would be more expensive in terms of the capital outlay of being able to provide services to any location, and would take a lot longer to actually fit out. So we divided the building into zones within which each of the various elements could be accommodated. So looking at this plan here, the blue zone towards the top of the plan is the office stroke meeting room zone. The purple zone, magenta zone to the bottom of the plan is basically the laboratory zone. And then the central area, which is yellow and orange on the plan, is a flexible area that can be adapted to be either offices and meeting rooms or lab support spaces and stores, depending on the individual tenant requirements. And then to each end, there's then in the purple zone a staff tea point, so staff breakout area. Talking first of all about the core area, the core to the building. The central core of the building is positioned in the middle to give access to both of the tenancy areas on each floor. So the front is the main entrance, which overlooks the parkland setting. And that contains the main accommodation staircase, it contains the passenger lift, and also contains waiting areas, seating area for tenants, and has the provision for a reception desk should a company take the entire building and want to use that as a reception area. And you can see here, this is the interior of the front of the building. You can see the glass staircase going up to first floor level, seating areas there at ground floor and also at first floor level. Nice double height space, interesting lighting. There's a display screen there for giving information on the building, tenants and so forth. And the area where the purple seating there is the area where the reception could be located if required. The main entrance, as I said, looks out onto the parkland setting, fully glazed screen there, so it benefits from the views of the lovely landscaped area in the centre of the two buildings. To the back of the central area is the goods in area, which there's a goods in service yard with some external stores which contain various laboratory related storage areas. The goods in area has its own dedicated goods lift and gives access to the two wings of lab accommodations directly for health and safety reasons. In between the two of those, there is then the WC core, which has individual WC units with their own self-contained basins, toilets, etc., as well as showers, lockers, and disabled facilities. Moving on to the office area, which is the blue area on the plan. This was really fitted out to a Cat A standard, but as I say, it's customizable to suit individual tenant requirements. So if we look on to the next slide, we can see the Cat A open plan fit out that was undertaken initially. So to enable us to accommodate cellular offices, meeting rooms and so forth without undue disruption to the fabric that have been constructed, we've put in a series of ceiling bulkheads within the ceiling void above the suspended ceiling level, which have necessary fire stopping, necessary acoustic breaks, and also within each zone have separate fan call units and smart fire and smoke detectors, etc. And similarly, there's a raised access floor which has acoustic barriers, fire barriers, etc. on the lines of those potential partitions. The idea being that it's therefore relatively easy to insert partitions to suit individual tenant requirements to create meeting rooms, cellular offices, etc., without having to break down ceilings and do major M&E alterations. You can see the ceiling grid there, and throughout the building is laid out to actually allow those partitions to go up within plasterboard margins. And we've carried that ceiling grid right the way through the office area for visual continuity. You can see here how one of the tenants has actually fitted out that space. In the background there, you can see some cellular offices, full height glass screens. Those have been inserted below the ceiling bulkheads. They obviously then benefit also from the views to the outside that you can see there on the parkland setting. As part of the fit out, we've included the blinds, and most of the tenants have fitted their offices out in that linear form so that the staff benefit from the oblique views and light from the outside. This particular tenant's incorporated storage wall facilities to the back of the area. Now, some of these fit outs were actually undertaken during the actual construction of the Cat B, and there's a couple of tenants have actually done their own customised fit outs post practical completion for that. As I said, these areas can be fitted out to either cellular offices or meeting rooms, and we can see here an example of a meeting room with glazed screens looking out onto the main open plan office area. We've got raised access floors, facilities for AV and so forth in those rooms, as you'd expect. And again, those can be subdivided up into smaller rooms via those ceiling bulkheads should the tenants require a suite of smaller meeting rooms rather than just a larger meeting room. The floor-to-floor heights on the building is out of interest is 4.2 metres. It's a concrete frame, flat slab. The ceiling heights are generally set at 2.7 metres, and that gives us a 1.2 metre surface zone within the ceiling void. And now that's mainly required because of the amount of servicing required to laboratory areas. as I mentioned, then the next area I'll talk about is the flexible zone, which is in the centre of the plan there, which is coloured in orange and yellow. And as I said, that area is really the area where the tenants can vary the amount of office to lab space depending on their own individual requirements. The yellow areas on there are primarily required for storage, and they're next to the goods in, as you'd expect. So there's stores, there's -80 stores, and there's space for a cold room, packaged cold room, if the tenants wish to fit that. But equally, those rooms can be used for other purposes. The orange areas are the flexible, either offices, meeting rooms, or lab support prep rooms, or specialist lab areas. The enclosing walls to those areas were constructed, but the partitions within them were left again flexible to enable them to be larger or suites or smaller rooms, depending on the tenant requirements. The services to those areas are all put in to suit lab function, obviously the numbers of air changes required, etc., with capped off services for water supplies and so forth for lab use, should that be required. And you can see here's an example of one of those rooms where it's been fitted out as a meeting room with a glazed screen with interstitial blinds. Another example where it's fitted out as a laboratory store with a vinyl floor with rack shelving and so forth in it. The next example here shows how it's been fitted out as a tissue culture room with recirculating safety cabinets and other scientific equipment installed within it, and again a vinyl floor. So that really gives that sort of flexibility to the space. Then, as I say, it mentioned earlier, at each end of the building, there's then a T-point staff breakout space, one for each of the individual tenants. We've put those to the end of the building so that they're central between the labs and the office areas, with doors to each side, so that lab staff can go in there as easily as office staff. And equally, they take advantage of the views down to the river and across the parkland at the front. The T-points were sort of fitted out as a basic T-point, and then they've been customised by individual tenants to suit their own requirements. And we can see here an example of how one of the tenants has extended the base T-point to include extra facilities such as microwaves, more storage, peninsular benching, and so forth, and actually put partitions in again on this flexible grid that we've allowed for to actually create a self-contained staff room. We left all the finishes quite neutral because of to leave them flexible for corporate colours and things like that. The last area then within the building is the laboratory zone, which is at the bottom of the plan there, the magenta zone. That's set out in a linear run to allow flexibility of numbers and size of laboratories. The basic fit out there we incorporated as the generic fit out was divided into 3 rooms: a smaller room, a medium-sized room, a larger sized room on a 6.6 metre grid, which suits laboratory furniture and gives a 1.5 metre aisle between benching, which is sort of normal standard. However, tenants can put extra partitions in on each of those grid lines, or could take those partitions out, and additional doors can be inserted through knockout panels that are included within the external wall to the corridor there, which leads the goods in. So again, there's flexibility there to create smaller or larger lab rooms, again, without having to undertake major alterations to the infrastructure of the building. The services are set up on a series of 6 modules to each of those wings, so they can be up to 6 separate lab areas should the tenants require. There's some views of the inside of these labs. So the lab furniture has been designed in a modular basis to allow the removal of sections of that furniture. So you see in the foreground here one of the typical peninsular benches, which has a lab sink on the end, which is really a fixed item because of the servicing going to it. We've then got 2 service droppers to each bench run, which enables us or a tenant to remove one of those or more of those modules of lab furniture to leave space for other equipment, yet still be able to service each end of that module. So each of those is effectively a separate table with separate legs that can be pulled out and replaced with other things. Or where we've got the situation where they're on a potential partition line, they're actually back to back so that a whole wing run can be removed, a partition could be put in, and then the benching put back in place. Now, this is not something that you could come in on a Monday morning and think, well, we can figure our lab now. It needs planning, but it does mean that you can put partitions in, or if a tenant leaves and a new tenant comes on board, it can be customized to suit them without having to undertake major work, without having to scrap and order new lab furniture. So again, it's all about flexibility and minimizing the downtime between tenancies, which obviously maximizes rental for Biomed. Further views of the lab benching there. We've got reagent shelving there with all the services for the bench on the daily trunking above. There's further services below the sliding doors. And then some of the areas have been fitted out as specialist rooms, and we can see here where one of the lab modules has been fitted out with a fume cupboard and other lab-rated equipment. Each of the lab modules or wings can accommodate up to 8 fume cupboards, and the services are in the plant room and the flues to enable that to happen, again minimising the amount of work that's needed to allow a tenant to put fume cupboards into the building. And so again, further views are the same really, showing how people have put modular mobile underbench units in there to give storage under the benches. They're on casters so they can be moved about, taken away as required. Underbench fridges can be put in. Windowsill heights to the labs are set so that we can run dado trunking and power and services above the lab benching and below the windowsills, which maximises the amount of benching run. And the amount of benching run is really key to the lab use, because that's what the scientists work on. The floor space between is almost wasted space as far as they're concerned. We've included blinds in the project for the labs and glaze screens to the office corridors or the lab corridors for health and safety reasons and allow light through into the building. Thank you very much. I'd like to just hand you back now to Orestis, who will do a summary.
Thank you, Duncan. That's been very helpful indeed. So yeah, as Duncan said, one of the overarching themes for the buildings that we delivered here was to do with flexibility and adaptability. Tenant needs change over time. Certainly in this sector, perhaps change is more prevalent than others in a sort of shorter window of time. So the ability in the inherent design for change within a shorter window is extremely important, both within tenant operations themselves, but also between tenants, moving in and out of the buildings, was one of the key themes that we certainly wanted to pursue here. I think another element to note here, and we did talk about the campus overall a few minutes ago in the introduction, but part of the ethos of the campus was the collaboration spirit and the ability to share the wider premises, including the landscaped areas, which is a core theme here for Babraham, where people can actually use the great surroundings, either as breakout spaces or in the sort of, summer months as informal meeting spaces. It's one of the sort of the key drivers and certainly themes for Babraham Research Campus, one of the nicest certainly landscapes that I've seen in a while. And you will see here some of the images of the building surroundings, quite generous spaces for tenants to use, during lunch times or breakouts. Overall, here again, more breakout spaces. And indeed a view of the overall scheme and its relationship to the wider campus. From an aerial shot here, you'll see the car parking, bike shelters, servicing access, but also the proximity to other campus facilities. The campus also offers a conference center, which was delivered about 3 or 4 years ago now, with a fully fitted restaurant. There is another outlet as well closer to these buildings that serves hot food for tenants. There is a gym on the campus as well as outside tennis courts, and there is really a spirit here of collaboration and, as I said, campus ethos that is being promoted by the management team that provides full services for the tenants, which is exactly why they opt to choose locating here in the first place, but also choosing Babraham as their home for growth over the various stages of the business development, which is exactly what this particular project came in to fulfill. So that is the summary. Mike, if I can hand back to you.
Orestis, yeah, thank you very much for that. And also to Duncan, for a very comprehensive and technical. These buildings are very technical, and it's important to understand really the whole thought process that goes into it. I was quite interested. I don't think you necessarily set out at the beginning to offer serviced or fitted, not serviced rather. That's probably a different that would be a different subject, but fitted labs. When we came round and looked at the building, probably a year ago, in its final stages of construction, there was that discussion as to do you offer it as fitted space, do you offer it as shell and core or unfitted? And the building, you haven't really talked about the success, but you're now fully let, I think, Orestis, aren't you? You're 100% let on both buildings. And was the fitting out decision the precursor to having it all let on completion, or was it a response to tenant demand?
That's a great question, Mike. And I think certainly what we've seen from the benefit, if you like, of running a global portfolio, also with our presence over in the States, a common theme that we've seen, and obviously it hasn't been, I think, until this project, it hadn't really been tested in the Cambridge market here in the UK, was traditionally what you would find is that if you're starting a new development here, certainly on the laboratory side, it would be delivered on a shell and core basis. The infrastructure, if you like, of the building in most cases would be provided for by the landlord. But when it comes to the finishes, in terms of the lab configuration that Duncan talked about, because of the inherent needs of certain tenants, being quite specialist, that is not normally provided for by landlords. What we have found in the US or the portfolio there is that companies that are in the sort of growth space of the business, because of the way they raise funding, there are certain limitations in how they can deploy capital. If you are able to provide a level of fit out that meets the majority, if you like, of their requirements, whilst allowing enough flexibility and adaptability within the design, it sort of bridges that gap, and provides a space within which they can operate. And I think a lot of it has to do, twofold. Number one is our confidence in the sector. We're really specialist developers and investors in the sector, so we have got these relationships and experience to understand, if you like, the nature of the product that is required. But I think secondly as well, our understanding of the evolving tenant needs through our platform, where we have facilities, in-house facilities and operations teams, and understand how the space actually gets adapted over the course of the lease, helped us. So there was a lot of information there within the business that we could leverage, as we ended up designing those spaces. So I think that decision, if you like, of going ahead and delivering a space that was fit for purpose and offering the flexibility and adaptability to tenants was a catalyst in driving the success, ultimately, because, within the window that you described, from completion of what would be deemed the shell and core element until the completion early this year of the actual fitted space, I think 75% of the space was already leased, so that is sort of quite a significant part of the process in achieving that.
And do you apply the same principles to your other schemes elsewhere in terms of the sort of difference between shell and fitted? Because we also had that discussion as to cold shell and warm shell. I'm not sure whether those are industry definitions, but I was always slightly confused as to quite what the difference was between a warm shell and core or a cold shell and core or a basic shell and core.
Sure. I mean, it's quite warm shell and cold shell are the sort of definitions primarily used in the US. I think in the UK, when we talk about the shell and core, really the service building in terms of the infrastructure and the plans and what it's been provided for in terms of the air handling units and the boilers and chillers, to service to a certain specification. And obviously the cores are fitted out, to fully, as it were. Whereas in the US, you could effectively get a cold shell, which is basically the structure of the building, so the fabric of the building with all the, structure and the curtain walling and everything else. But, the plant room would be sort of a fallow space where tenants can come in and install their own air handling units to meet their ventilation requirements. Whereas the warm shell is actually what we regard here in the UK as the shell and core, so it's that sort of differentiation. The cold shell is perhaps a precursor to that sort of finish. I think a lot of it depends as well on the tenant requirements, so if you've got a larger corporation, sort of a tenant that has got the capability for like in-house because of their scale and headcount to have a dedicated team, on the facility side, then it's somewhat easier for them to undertake that, directly and be more hands-on, if you like, as well. The other thing is the lease structure. A lot of these companies will take much longer leases. So there is a level of flexibility there as well on how we structure it. But, in this particular case, you offer flexibility to tenants across all fields, so that is, building flexibility, but also structure flexibility, because some of these tenants may actually outgrow even these premises within a certain window of time as they see approvals from, clinical trials and so on, and they need to move on to bigger and perhaps even more, dedicated spaces in terms of the function. So our ability then to, step in and provide that solution for the next step, even outside the terms of the agreed lease is another attraction to them, because it's really building that relationship rather than the sort of strict landlord and tenant theme, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads us quite nicely into, we're getting quite a few questions coming up on the Q&A on the chat. So thank you for those, and please keep them coming in. But the first couple seem to relate to the services. And there's a question from Erland Rendell, which is really to do with services, and it was, I guess, with a multi-let building or a variety of tenants and different tenant demands. How was the building designed and serviced, and in terms of accommodating different service requirements for the different tenants, and how is that managed in relation to base level service provision and then tailored to particular tenant needs.
Coming in briefly on that,
Duncan, probably.
Yeah. So basically, as I've mentioned, the building is divided into two wings and two floors. You can see on the aerial view here, I didn't mention plant rooms, but the plant rooms for the building run the length of the building, primarily above the lab areas, which obviously denotes heavily serviced areas. So each wing effectively has a plant room above it, which is accessed from the goods lift. Within the building, we've got 5 air handling units. So there's 1 air handling unit that serves the landlord areas, which obviously the shell, the core. And then there's 2 air handling units in each of the wings that serve the accommodation below. So effectively, each of the 4 modules has its own air handling unit, which feeds down to fan coil units in the ceiling void above each of the modules I mentioned for the flexibility. So it's the same air handling unit that serves the labs and the offices, but the airflows are controlled to give different air change rates to the labs and the offices. And the base for the labs is 6 air changes per hour, but that is customizable to suit individual modules within the labs should tenants require sort of more than that. There is space within the plant room as well for additional tenant plants. So we didn't include within the project specialist things such as chilled water or RO water systems and things like that, because you can't predict easily what individual tenants are going to require in terms of those facilities. But we did include spaces within the plant rooms to enable these plants to be installed, and spaces within the risers to enable tenants to drop those services down to their individual floor areas. Similarly, as I said, there's an external stores building which contains things like gas cylinder store, liquid nitrogen stores and things, which are divided up into 4 separate caged areas. So each tenant has their own area. And then there's a duct that runs into the building, and there was a provision of 2 gas pipelines, for example, from the external stores into the building, up in the riser, terminating in the ceiling void as it comes into the lab areas for the tenants to extend to incorporate their own lab gases, because again, you can't predict what gases are required, but there's also scope for additional pipelines should tenants require more than that. So we put this basic provision in that was flexible, but also incorporated extra space and facilities for tenants to actually put their own services in as they required. And I mentioned the fume cupboards, for example, as an example of that. You can see the flues there on the roof. As I said, there's a scope for 8 fume cupboards per floor. Our experience is that most of these biomedical companies don't need that amount of fume cupboards, but the facilities are there should they require that. And those fume cupboards can be put anywhere within the lab area, and the risers and the infrastructure is all designed to suit that. Should that be required now or in the future?
I think that starts to answer the a question raised by Alan West, who was talking about the building resilience, and I can't remember whether we talked about emergency backup power or emergency generators, but also the ability to bring different services according to needs. So
I mean, in terms of
querying from Alan, which you partially answered, I think, Duncan.
Yeah, but the other one that I didn't mention was backup generation. So each building has a backup generator, which is in a compound at the rear of the building near to the external stores. And that actually gives 100% coverage of the electrical power in the building. The reason for that is we couldn't predict with multiple tenancies any sort of divergence from that. I mean, sometimes in a dedicated lab building, for a known tenant, you look at power and say what's critical. It might be the lab areas, the office areas aren't so critical, so the backup generator only serves a certain percentage of the power requirements of the building. In this instance, you can't predict what each tenant's going to want and require, so you can't have a situation where the first tenant takes up all the generator capacity and then there's none left for the other tenants, so it's 100% coverage. There's also a provision within the service yard for sprinkler plant. There's no sprinklers included in the building, but there was a facility included. Should a single tenant take the whole building, for example, and require sprinklers, there's scope to install those, albeit obviously there's a lot of work to do that. In terms of UPS, there was no dedicated UPS provider apart from the landlord's comms cabinets. But each of the tenanted areas has a dedicated comms area within it, which I didn't mention when I talked about the layout. And it's down to the tenants to install their own UPS, again, because we can't predict what their individual requirements are going to be and what they need to cover with the UPS.
Okay, there's a few more technical ones coming through. Back to Alan again. Did you wrestle with a steel frame and composite floor before resolving to the flat slab concrete frame?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this has really come about through experience. And we've been fortunate enough as architects to be involved on this campus and Cambridge Science Park and elsewhere, but on this campus since the inception of the campus in the master plan in 2003, and designed virtually all the buildings on the campus. And through the development of that, we've found that the flat slab concrete solution is the most flexible in terms of services, because there's no downstand beams within ceiling voids. You have a completely flat soffit, and particularly when you have service risers, we've found with steel frame that you inevitably end up with steel beams around the service risers to trim them, and that's the last place you want beams, because that's where the services are coming out. So the flat slab concrete solution gives maximum flexibility in terms of making sure there's nothing in the way of services. It's also good for labs because of less vibration in the structure, which can be an issue with some sensitive scientific equipment. And one thing I didn't mention as well related to vibration is we have incorporated within the design, and it hasn't been taken up by the tenants, there is an isolated slab area within the ground floor, which allows for the construction of a specialist vibration sensitive room within its own isolated slab should a tenant require that. Again, that was a flexible feature to deal with that. It hasn't actually been taken up by any of the tenants. But having done a number of these buildings on steel, starting with steel frame, then composite, then concrete, we've come to the conclusion that the concrete is the best way forward, albeit it's perhaps slightly longer on construction period, but that is then offset by the lack of need to actually firebox out steel beams and so forth. And as I say, the flexibility for services is the best with that.
Mm-hmm. And a couple, I think you did start to talk about raised access floors, but can you just remind us? There's a question whether there are raised access floors across the building or just in particular areas, and possibly in relation to the flexible space rather than the lab space.
Yeah, so basically, I didn't talk in detail about that. Apologise. Yes, so the office areas have a 150mm raised access floor throughout, and there was a grid of floor boxes included as part of the basic offering, which could be moved obviously by tenants or to suit tenants, and additional ones added as required. The lab areas, because of the dedicated lab areas, and this comes back to what I was talking about earlier on about ultimate flexibility, that you could create a situation where you can put anything everywhere, but that actually has cost implications and program implications. So where we've got a dedicated lab area, such as the main lab wing, we've got a screed floor. So there's no raised access floors there because that's not required. In fact, it's not advised really under a lab. In the central area, the flexible area, the areas on my plan that were on our plan that was in yellow for storage, they've got screeded concrete floors, but some of the other flexible areas have actually got a raised access floor to allow that to be used for a meeting room and put power and data underneath. And where that's been fitted out as a lab, we've actually put applied over the top of the raised access floor and then continuous vinyl to make sure it's waterproof. But should a tenant in the future want to revert that back to a meeting room, want to put AV in the floor, then that can come up and the access floor is then available.
Thanks for that, Duncan. Just looking at the questions, there are a couple appearing on sort of rent or appraisals, which let's come back to that in a minute. Danny was really interested in how is security handled in a multi-tenanted building, and I guess there's two issues there. Probably one which is raised in the question in terms of sensitive information being isolated between different businesses, but also the cross-contamination issues of having multi-lets within a science building.
Okay, well, in terms of security, first of all, the campus itself has its own security point upon access to the campus. So any visitors have to be booked in to actually get onto the campus itself by the company that they're going to visit. So that's the first thing, that people can't just arrive on the campus. Each of the two buildings has its own access control on its front door, which is flexible in terms of it can be free to enter the entrance area during normal working hours, or can be on access controlled out of hours. And there's entry com system there which feeds to each of the 4 tenant areas to allow tenants to let people in and out of hours situations. Each of the 4 tenant wings then has its own access control to its door from the front entrance area into the offices, and from its door from the service goods in area to the lab areas, and then there's further access control on the back service entrance. So effectively control is given to each of the tenants, to each of their wings, to allow only people they want, by access card, to be able to enter those wings. Obviously, there's overriding cards for maintenance staff, campus maintenance staff. Then within the building itself, we've then put in containment to allow access control to be fitted to individual offices, or particularly individual areas that we felt might need security. And that, for example, is all the laboratory modules and the specialist areas, where often they need to control who can go into a certain lab, who can go into a certain specialist room. So there's an infrastructure of containment that tenants can add their own access control over and above the overall building access control to suit their requirements. And obviously the way we set the building out with their central entrance and the 2 wings, there's no need or no desire for a tenant to go outside their wing into the other tenant's wing, unless a tenant's taken both wings of a floor, in which case obviously they have the overall access control to that wing as well. And access to the plant room is directly from the central area, again via the lift, with its own dedicated access control to plant level, just to minimise any staff being able to go up into the plant areas. In terms of the biosafety aspect, the way we divided the building up is such that effectively each tenant has their own self-contained area in each wing, their own plant. If they have dedicated plant for themselves, it's in the plant room above their wing. And as I mentioned earlier, the stores have got their own individual caged areas and zones for each tenant. So other than obviously the shared goods in area, which is sort of unavoidable, the containment is all within each tenant's area, and they can control what they're doing in those zones.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Duncan. I think these next couple of questions might be directed back to you, Orestis. One of the earlier ones was the how do you deal with the funding or the financing for additional fit outs where you've got tenants possibly requiring different levels of fit out or finishes. How does the fit out stack up in terms of a financial appraisal? And how do you deal with the additional costs in terms of a rental? Higher rents or tenant contributions to the fit out. Was everything covered under a single rent? And then at the end, you can tell we've got a couple of agents sitting in on the presentation. We've got a question as to what sort of rent levels that have you been achieving?
Sure. So in terms of the actual fit out, as Duncan mentioned, we have taken the fit out up to a level where you have, sort of a Cat A on the office side, and then an equivalent sort of, like Cat B product on the lab side, where you get, sort of the lab benching in and all the infrastructure almost sort of, ready to start, if you like. Obviously, tenants will require to make their own modifications, and in most cases, they have been funded directly by the tenants for these additional, variations. But in terms of, sort of comparative terms, those are, not to, I mean, they're not insignificant sums, but they're not, sort of sums that you would expect. One is investing in fitting out a space from scratch, so many tenants have actually taken the cost themselves and fitted out the space to their own requirements to give them a sort of level of flexibility as far as their own business function is concerned. In terms of rental levels, I think it was somewhere in the region of £43.50. I think that was the sort of the rental level achieved here. And it's very much sort of in line, if you like, with fully fitted lab space, that we see in the region as well since then. So, as you said, it was a product, if you like, pioneering that level of finishes, in the market, because a lot of the space that you find, certainly in Cambridge, that is fitted is perhaps sort of reversionary space that comes back to the market from another tenant that fitted it out. So in many circumstances, that is a bit more bespoke, that sort of, links back to the original tenant's requirements, whereas in our case, this was much more flexible with a view to actually tap into a much wider market as possible. And as I said earlier, a lot of it was delivered on the premise of our in-house, sort of experience, especially from the facilities and operations front.
And then a final one, sort of on a similar subject, was if you're able to give us any insight on the total build cost.
I need to. I don't really have a figure, because it's the way that we've actually delivered this, as you mentioned earlier, was we did the shell and core first, and then we came back and did the fit out in sort of different contracts effectively. But I think in total the whole project was in excess. I haven't got the exact figure, but the whole deal was in excess of £50 million. That was the total,
Yeah. There was a question about the wings being easily subdivided. I think you demonstrated that they have been subdivided, but I think Richard did ask a question: how many tenants? How many tenants did you end up in the building, in both buildings?
Six tenants. So one building is 4, and the other one is 2. But you could have up to 8 tenants. I mean, there is an option to subdivide each building up to 4 wings in total.
I think that the unit sizes, from memory, were then from sort of 12,500 square feet being the smallest tenant,
Yep.
up to a 25
or 50, yes.
25,000 square foot for a half a, for one half of the building, presumably.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, hopefully that answers that question. We haven't got much time left, I'm afraid, and there's been a great series of questions coming in. There was a more general question, which is quite interesting. What are the green credentials?
Duncan, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah, so we undertook the service engineers undertook a LZC feasibility study, and that has been undertaken for the campus as a whole. Basically, for this building, we incorporated air source heat pumps to enable us to reduce the energy reduction. So the air source heat pumps provide power the heating, and they've got backup boilers as well. So those air source heat pumps give about a reduction of 12% on the energy usage of the building. There's also we've gone for a sort of fabric first approach in terms of higher insulation standards, the walls, roof, floors, etc. And the air permeability achieved was actually less than 2, which is a very good standard. So it's a very much a fabric first approach in terms of actually containing the energy usage. To provide with the air source heat pumps, as long as together with things like usual things such as LED lighting, as point of use water heaters, which gives flexibility in the labs and so forth. But primarily it was the air source heat pumps, which is a preferred method on this building. I mean, elsewhere on the campus, it sells air source heat pumps and PVs. On this development, it was just air source heat pumps that provided what was required.
I think that there might have been one final question. What are the competitive advantages of Babraham over the other offers around Cambridge? I mean, that's probably a fairly broad question. I suppose maybe why did you choose Babraham rather than any other part to develop and invest in Orestis?
Sure. Well, I think, in terms of our footprint, we also have, obviously presence at Granta Park, which we own, and also space up at the Science Park. So, we are sort of, across 3 different geographies. I think the attraction of Babraham in particular was twofold. Number one, as a leading, I think also, looking at the numbers that I mentioned earlier from the impact study, it's one of the leading European centres in terms of early stage, life science development, and that is one of the big attractions as a location. It attracts early stage companies. They're very successful. A lot of great companies has actually come out of Babraham Research Campus over the years, and the clustering effect, coupled with the proximity to organizations like the Babraham Institute and also Cambridge University, where there are a number of synergies here, but also and perhaps equally as important is the level of services that BBT that run the campus provide for these companies. Smaller companies, and I mentioned there's about 60 of them here, plus obviously what we've delivered here in the last year. They don't have necessarily the in-house capability when it comes to facilities management or operations, and BBT are offering that as part of the campus wider offering, which is very important to smaller tenants, that are growing, to know that if you make a call, someone can come and fix an issue within the lab space or respond on an ad hoc basis. The collaboration, the proximity, the ability to co-locate with like-minded companies and have the sort of talent pool in one location is extremely attractive, as is the amenity offering here as well. The things like the conference center, the access to the restaurants, the access to the gym. Tenants that are based here can also access our services down at Granta Park, where we've got the apiary, which is 40,000 square feet of gym space, the nursery. So it's that sort of holistic offer, if you like, that makes it very, very attractive. And I think that is actually manifested in the success of the scheme itself. The fact that before completion, we've managed to have let the majority of the space and said at completion the building was 100% leased. So that is a testament, I think, to those very strong credentials of the campus.
I think it's also important to mention the grow-on aspect. I mean, the core business at Babraham is incubator type units, small incubator units for startup companies, as Orestis has mentioned. Inevitably and thankfully, with that number of companies on the campus, there's a success rate where companies are growing and growing out of their space. And what Babraham were finding is that some companies were taking over several modules of the incubator accommodation, which was causing them clogging up the sort of pipeline, because there's people waiting to get into the buildings, but the space wasn't available. But companies who are growing into and needed bigger space were reluctant to leave the campus because of the support it offered and the relationships they built up with other companies. So be able to remain on the campus, but move into the larger size of facilities where they can have their own meeting rooms and their own CEOs' offices and things, which in the incubator units are sort of shared facilities, meeting rooms and things, was an attractive offer, and it also enabled the freeing up of space from Babraham's point of view to allow more companies who wanted to come into the campus on an incubator level to actually come into those buildings that were actually designed for them. So it's a pipeline really, this has created that sort of next step for these companies that wasn't fully available at Babraham to the extent it possibly could have been.
I think that I think that last question, or your response to the last question, is a perfect way to finish the presentation. Babraham's in a good it's in a very good position. It's been very successful, and it will continue to do so. So my thanks to both Orestis and Duncan for this morning's presentation. Just very quickly, in 1 minute, in terms of future BCO events, on the 28th of October, there's a new piece of national research coming out, which is fire safety in tall buildings. So look out for that on the 28th of October. The next East Anglia Cambridge event, we are hoping to run a planning webinar dealing with the impact of the new planning changes on how they affect officers in terms of the changes to the use classes order. We are hoping that will happen on the 17th of November, date still to be confirmed, and that will be run with BCO and Mills and Reeve. Next week is a big week for the BCO, in that it's the Bco Awards week. We're not able to run live property awards as we used to, so the property awards ceremonies are going to be a series of events around the country, and next Monday is kicking off with the Midlands and the East Anglia event. Talking with Danny, I think there are over 350 people due to attend that Monday's event, so there's still space to attend. It will provide opportunities for networking, and then obviously the actual awards event. So I think that will be quite interesting. And as I said at the beginning, there's still loads more BCO events coming through. So thank you to everybody this morning. Thank you to Bryony for setting this up at BCO, and thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Thank you.